This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, I asked Joey about compromise.
Woo!
Please tell me why. This is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer who is lit, Jess Vander, sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess.
I couldn't remember the other lines, and it felt semi-relevant to the conversation that I think we're going to talk about, Jess.
Wow.
You've been cogitating?
I have been cogitating. Maybe super cogitating.
Whoa.
Whoa. Put a cape on it. I don't think we have any housekeeping. Are we just jumping in? Are we diving in?
Yeah,
Wow.
let's...
Look at that.
We're about that business.
Look at us go. That's so atypical. I'm like, what do I do with my hands? Okay. Yeah, I have a thing I wanted to pick your brain on. I was listening to technically I was reading a transcript of a recent episode of the Ezra Klein show, who is host at the New York Times. He had brought on Ta-Nehisi Coates because they had this exchange via sort of warring articles. Ezra Klein had written after Charlie Kirk's assassination. He had written an article praising Charlie Kirk's political savvy. And Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a scathing sort of counter article about Ezra Klein's article saying, hey, like, you can't celebrate this individual who spewed and sowed so much hatred over the course of his lifetime, like that you're leaving a rosy image of him and his legacy, and you shouldn't do that because of his hate. And regardless of where you sit on this issue politically, for one, I was really interested that even in the premise that Ezra Klein, in sort of the response to Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, was like, I'm going to invite this person onto my show so we can talk about it. Like that as a, it was really hopeful and beautiful to me, of like, we clearly vehemently morally disagree on this subject, and I want to sit down and have a conversation. It was really cool. And it was also a really interesting conversation that they had, because they have two very, very different perspectives on this question that I think ultimately, I don't want to spoil the whole conversation for you, but I would highly recommend reading it, just as sort of like an interesting snapshot of our political discourse at this time. But something that I noticed was this question about like what it is to be political and how inherent to politics you have to make strategic sacrifices in order to, in sort of the long arc, win. Maybe you lose the battle, but you win the war, kind of an adage. And it was really interesting the way that Ezra Klein was sort of trying to advocate for this idea, seeing himself as sort of a player in politics, saying like, is it not my responsibility to, even in my work, offer strategic, losses if I think that is sort of the ultimate long game for success, for quote unquote winning. And it was interesting that Ta-Nehisi Coates' response is like, is that your role? I'm not sure that your job is to be political. Maybe your job is to stand by your moral compass, and you're a podcast host, you're a writer, you're a journalist. Like, is your job to more express how, like, what you're seeing and state the facts? And so I don't know, it just it opened up this bigger conversation, or this question for me about how we are grappling with the concept and sort of the typical sort of pillars of politics as a culture, and if maybe we have at some point become less comfortable with strategic loss, or or are at least grappling with that question of like, actually, no, like I will move, I will not budge an inch. Is it, and like, what is sort of the state of that? So I guess my question to pick apart today is, what if we've become less willing to sacrifice our pawns to take the queen?
I think it's a like fascinating question or a framing of how to look at things. Interestingly, like I've been reading a book and recently they were talking about, like the difference between an adventurer and an explorer versus a politician is that a politician is trying to come to agreements and to like it needs to make strategic compromises, whereas the other doesn't need to. But it was making me think about that point that you bring up in terms of like the difference in perspective between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ezra Klein as being sort of necessary organs of like broader political debate and discussion, right? In general, Ezra Klein is like a self-described wonk. Like his original blog was called like I like something like Wonk Blog or something like that, or Beltway Wonk, or
they don't like that. That's
yeah,
a weird name.
But he sees himself as a policy wonk and trying to sort of orient towards policy, which is fundamentally resolution, which needs to be making compromise. Whereas Ta-Nehisi Coates is trying to speak truth to power and highlight where
exactly
issues exist that need to be resolved. And so like they're performing two different functions. One is like problem identification and one is problem resolution. And like the way in which you think about those two things is different. But I do think that idea, as you were talking, I was thinking about that phrase from the preamble of the Constitution of like, in order to create a more perfect union, which to me, I don't know if I'm not like a constitutional like philosopher or historian. I don't have that. But what I've always internalized that to mean is this idea that like it is sort of constant iterative progress, right? Like constitutional amendments, as an example, are like a pursuit of an ideal is a state that you will never necessarily achieve, but it is like constantly making these attempts at resolution. Whereas sort of like an ethical, moral, ideal absolutism sees all things that are not the sort of perfect state as a loss. And so even like how are you determining what is or isn't a loss is kind of like an interesting point within this.
100%. And it's also a part of this debate because even the idea of like losing the battle to win the war is still time stamped, right? Like there's like a still sort of a certain scope of that. And I think that, Ta-Nehisi Coates is arguing in this, at least the way I interpreted it, is arguing to say like, yes, but that still isn't resolving. There is always something bigger and deeper that isn't yet resolved at that, on the level of some pre-identified war. And not that his, he defends an accusation of that being sort of a nihilistic outcome of like, well, there's always going to be something that can't be resolved. And instead he's like, no, that's actually precisely why I feel more like my role is to speak to what I am seeing, like state things as clearly as I possibly can and make sure that is sort of what he's saying is sort of his lane and his role. And it's very interesting to think about like resolution. It's like, well, resolution of, one thing, but there's always, there will always be some bigger thing that won't be able to be resolved. And when do you draw the line of well, that's good enough for me to make this, meaningful step forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw something this week actually, and it was sort of just like, it was tied to a maybe 2-minute video about Obama. And it was saying something to the effect of like, Gen Z has more effectively made the case for why Obama was an incredible president in this video than the Democratic Party has, and all of its like might has been able to do in the 8+ years since he was president. And it's really interesting where so much of the criticism, I think, that came from the left side of politics towards Obama was oriented towards his willingness to compromise often. Well, like, he did this, but he gave up that, right? Like, and it was like he didn't sort of claim like absolute scorched earth victory and all of these things, right? Even in like the ACA, he didn't get to single payer as an example of like one of those things where it's like, well, he was a flawed president because of this. But when you see all of the things stacked up in a 2-minute video and they're just like firing, you're like, oh, like he clearly like was able to accomplish so much, even often not having like the sort of 3 branches of government supporting what he was doing. Like, compromise is required in that for sort of shared victory. And I think I think about this occasionally, like as a CEO, like in that function, I am not trying to be political, but it is sort of inherently a political, right? Like there will be different opinions within our company on different stances, and often it is trying to sort of align in agreement. There are areas where probably like I wouldn't budge because it feels like a moral or ethical issue that I feel strongly enough about. But more broadly, the company isn't like a reflection of me. It is a reflection of the group of people. And so you sort of, if I was coming in it with like an absolutism, it would feel radically different.
Well, yeah, and maybe that also ties back to this, like, everybody has their role in driving towards progress, but part of what is on display here is like whether we need to make a value judgment on which is more important, or like what do we need right now? Do we need, more of the role of a politician, like the sort of philosophy of compromise makes progress? Or do we need more, like who we need right now is actually more of the advocate sort of archetype where conviction makes progress? And it feels like it's sort of warring schools of thought of like, what is it, like, who do we need right now? Like, what is that idea that we need to move forward in sort of the long arc of history?
Yeah. I mean, it is, you have to be thinking about sort of non-zero sum games. I think like sometimes you see or hear things where, one party who disagrees or feels like they have to present disagreement ask for concessions based on optics, right? Of being like, in a Washington.
Look, I tried.
Yeah. Or like, okay, you can author this. We'll say you're the author, so you get the victory, even though you're agreeing to a thing that I actually authored. So you're scoring political points, but I'm getting the outcome that I want, right? And so like even in that sort of like political dynamic, like what are the wins that can be exchanged? Because like ultimately like politics is negotiations, it has to be tied to reality, but it is saying like, okay, well, if I present this in a different fashion than what is my ideal, we can accomplish the thing that we're trying to accomplish, and everyone can sort of like walk away looking good, is like one path towards that, right? And it clearly, independently of whether Ezra Klein got it right or wrong, I only read excerpts from his original piece and excerpts from Ta-Nehisi Coates' rebuttal, but like clearly they are thinking about this in their own words, in like radically different ways of like, how do you implement policies that are sort of inching towards more justice, more fairness, more effective governance, whatever, versus, shining a light on where the current state of justice, fairness, equality exists.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And also like the sort of macro approach versus the more micro approach. Like it's easy to talk past each other if you're talking about different levels of like what we need versus what I need to do in my in my seat or position or whatever. Like even when you're talking about your role in our company, right? It's like, okay, in that it all comes back to that same thing of like, well, in that context, what are the things that what is the approach that you need to be taking?
Well, yeah, I mean, like we're recording this on Friday, October 3rd, and
It's October 3rd.
Yeah, I don't know when this will air, but like we're currently in a government shutdown, right? And sort of the state of that is largely dependent on like an unwillingness to compromise from the right now, saying like we're not going to have there was like a press conference saying like we're not going to have a negotiation because there's nothing to negotiate. And so like using that as an example, like everything stalls out when like the game theory is broken, right? Where the system requires participation and cooperation. And if you establish the game such that there is no opportunity for that, like everything stops. And that's true on like this giant macro scale, but it's like true in like one-on-one relationships also. Right. Of like, sometimes that question in relationships is like default to passion. Like when Ben and I were sort of exclusively like strategy partners and we worked on everything together, we explicitly said like default to passion. If you feel more strongly about this thing, then we'll trust each other enough to defer to the other one. And like that was a way to avoid like intractable problems maybe, or like individual intransigence of like when we disagreed, but like who disagrees more. And like, okay, we'll just default to that person and hope that it works out. But you need to sort of have that like system of like, how are we going to define losses? Like sometimes in like a romantic relationship, it's like one person wants everything like in a certain space or in a certain context to be a certain way, and it's really important to them, and the other one doesn't really care. But if you're choosing just like fight every fight and not like take the occasional L, like things don't work out.
Right. But I think that also is part of the, again, like the perspective of like, is this a cooperative game or is this a competition? Because if it's a competition, you're going down and I'm going to destroy you.
Yeah. But like, I mean, that's an interesting question. Again, in many things that I am not an expert in, like Nash equilibria and like game theory is one that I'm also not an expert in. But I'm curious, like in competitive games, the question of like, you might have imbalanced winning in competition, but like there are probably in real life games not as many scenarios where there's like zero win on both sides, right? It might be like 60-40 or 70-30, but like if you choose to force a game to be like, I get like absolute like binary, like you either completely win or you completely lose, like those situations tend to not work out particularly long term.
Yes, well, and relatedly and bizarrely, yesterday Ryan and I were talking about mutually assured destruction and like how that works as a like how to create
deterrence.
Stability in and in deterrence and in nuclear warfare. And a key piece of that is like you need to both, well, one, you need to know that this is a long game. If this is like a one shot, one off situation, then it's like, all right, well then whoever wins that wins the whole thing. But if it's like, no, we're going to need to continue, like this is an ongoing thing. That is a really key. If I retain anything from what I learned in game theory in college, is like that's the one key thing, is like it has to be an ongoing sort of result. Like that consequences will still remain and that this will continue to be a thing. And then there's another piece, which is like how almost like enforceable or sort of like assured is whatever the outcome. Like, can you trust each other is basically the idea. And like when we were talking about this in the context of nuclear weapons, it's like, well, if you at any point believe that actually the other guy is stronger than you, then you're going to stockpile and you're going to try to balance things out. And like that can create that sort of like uncertainty of, oh wait, maybe we aren't equal. That can create sort of the competitive skills again. Yeah, exactly. And so in order for everything to create that sort of stable cooperative equilibrium, you need to believe that you're like actually not able, that competing won't work. And so when I think back to the conversation we've been having, it's sort of a question of like, why, how is it like, is it because the scales are so tilted that actually it doesn't feel like equal footing? If it feels so imbalanced, like maybe the sense of one's quote unquote side winning and the other losing is perpetuating our, the continual struggle to find cooperation, to find compromise.
Right. I mean, I think like mutually assured destruction, what's interesting about it is you don't need to trust the other actor in that case. Like, you don't need to be able to predict how they would act. It is just the idea that like they have the capability of, creating a extreme negative outcome for you, right? And in that case, it's like it's a way of looking at game theory without cooperation. What's interesting in this like government shutdown is because conversation and negotiation shut down, because the bridge was burnt, we are sort of in a place of like mutually assured destruction. Like non-negotiation and the government shutting down hurts everybody, regardless of what side of the aisle that you're on. And so it is like a demonstration of like a game that requires cooperation, but still landed in a like mutually assured destructive outcome.
Right. Yeah. You're right. In that case, it's like, it's non-cooperative, but assuming everyone is rational and doesn't want to destroy every bit of existence, then you will reluctantly cooperate in a way. And that's all, like, that could be an acceptable outcome. Like, what about reluctant cooperation?
Yeah. Well, then it's about like establishing where in games where you don't trust the opponent, you have to like shift your strategy where outcomes aren't dependent on trust, right? Where like exchanges are happening up front and are not happening over time, and right, like you change the way that you would play that game, and that's part of where, like you were saying in like the longer term thing, like sports or like board games or things like that are interesting insofar as the parameters aren't established to like require longer term trust. It would be different, right, if you had like a gin club or like a mahjong club or whatever, where you're coming back weekly, and even though the game is like encased and has an end and doesn't require cooperation, you may operate differently to like not alienate the entire group, where then the whole group turns on you because you are, consistently doing like burn the whole thing down types of moves.
It's like, come on, don't do that.
Yeah. But like that's sort of like that question of like, when do you sacrifice the pawn to take the queen? Like the analogy breaks down because like in that case, like in the cases that we're talking about, like the game doesn't end unless you're playing it to end the game, right?
Or a game ends, but not you haven't thought about the metagame. What about the metagame?
Yeah.
And that's still going on. And thus we get back to sort of like the scope and timescale of bringing resolution to anything.
Yeah, but it's like, do you go with diplomacy? Do you go with like, what resource are you trying to take away? Is it really, like there are instances where, like as a banal day-to-day example, where like maybe an opportunity for work comes to us, but I'm like, these people, we might be able to do it, but these people could do it better. I will send a lead, give a recommendation to someone, or send a lead to someone else because I'm like, they'll do it better. The client will know that, and this other person will appreciate it if they get the work. And so in that instance, what I'm getting away is like helping others in, the hopes that at some point they would help me if I needed it or if a similar situation arose. But like if I just tried to like grab at everything that came my way, that even if it doesn't feel right, like invariably I'm not like establishing like a broader environment around me wherein others would help me or others would like support me or do something for me.
Wow. That's true. Although the individual level of all of this is like, then you get into like interpersonal confounds to all of this of like, oh, but like people like to do nice things for people who are nice to them, and also people are likely to do more if they ask you to do more. I don't know.
Yeah.
Man, yeah. I don't know
I
that
mean,
all of that is not necessarily transferable at the scale of populations and
yeah. I was talking
countries
to someone recently who was at a company, and someone had been there and like started playing like a burn it down game. Like they've started playing a game that was gonna like burn a lot of bridges and try and like take someone out within an organization. And this person was like, oh, that's the game that they're playing. And it wasn't at them, but they were like, okay, like I'm gonna do this differently. And the person wound up going away, but then reapplying back to the company after.
No.
And it came back through them, and she was like, nope, I'm going straight to the person who's running this hiring search and letting them know exactly what happened. And it was just like burnt, like scorched earth.
Done.
Like as soon as you start playing like a scorched earth game, like you have to expect that you've primed all other players for future knowledge that like they will have to be playing in that way, right?
Wow, that is some tea.
Tea.
That is some tea.
The
Be
full
nice.
story
Or
is
else.
even the full story is even more. You want to bring us to our chess corner, our game theory corner?
This is our chess corner? Yeah. It may very well be that we are just in a moment where we are seeing our role in the game differently than maybe in history or in other scales of battles. That right now there is so much worth having conviction about, that that in a way it is hard to imagine a world where we could even reluctantly cooperate with each other because of how deep cutting whatever that sacrifice may be. But I think what we're also saying is so much of that matters to sort of when and to what sort of scale you're trying to make progress.
Mhm.
And if you can create sort of, at least like some in nearer term step forward? Is there something in that is valuable? Is that a, more political, compromising, cooperative approach?
Yeah.
At least going to get us somewhere? Or is there another way where that requires a no, like not having to sacrifice one's morals to make progress in sort of the bigger picture, the long arc of history? I don't know. This is really hard, and I don't know, and I don't think any of us know, and that is all.
Yeah. Well, let's go watch A Beautiful Mind. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by Strong Feelings. Okay, you got it. After you.
As always, we'd like to thank our executive producer and Nash Equilibria, Jess Vander.
Thanks. We'd also like to thank our sound engineer and cooperative game player, Alex Guntel.
We'd like to thank our programming manager and Pareto principal, Les Jacobs.
And thank you to the ultimate people. Our production crew, Sarah Gilbert, Nora Mestrich, Chrissy Jensen, Amanda Medina, and Amy Waters.
And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Thanks.
Special thanks to A Beautiful Mind.
Yeah.
Help bring game theory more widely to people, maybe.
Yeah, that's actually a fair point. And so honestly, all those other series of movies, like, really love Benedict Cumberbatch in The Imitation Game. That's a really good one.
Yeah. Russell Crowe,
Wow.
We're out here. It gave us, at minimum, it gave us a lot of memes. So thanks, Russell.
Thanks for memes and for games and for chess.
Well, we did it.
Well, that's it.
Love you, mean it. Bye.
Bye.